Despite the rise in automation, the majority of modern-day warehouses still heavily rely on manpower, particularly during peak seasons. As such, today we're going to discuss how warehouses can prioritize decision, and in particular the concept of smoothing. So Joannes, what is it about kind of the characteristics of modern-day warehouses that make them quite so difficult to manage?
So a warehouse, a modern warehouse is pretty much designed for kind of an optimal regime, just like the engine of your car. You know, if it runs at I would say at a faster regime, so you get kind of diseconomies of scale. Why? Because basically you had your regular employees, and if you need basically to run, I would say beyond, peak productivity, you end up needing contractors, and you need to basically pay them more by the hour usually, and they happen to be, I would say, to have less training, and thus in reality they end up with a lower productivity. And then if you go the other side of the equation, if you have less people, you have your full-time employees that you pay no matter what. So even if you decide that you want to go, I would say, half regime, then you end up still paying at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter for the hours of all those people, even if you kind of lower the regime of the warehouse. So basically and that's just looking at the staffing element. The reality is that nowadays I would say most warehouses are automated to some varying degrees, with conveyor belts, with robot pickers, and plenty of things. And again, those investments are typically calibrated for a certain, I would say, flow of goods. So if you diverge from that, either you saturate your equipment or you don't use it to its full potential. So bottom line is that you have I would say, an optimal regime, or you can sometimes configure your warehouse to have maybe two optimal regime, one for the low season, one for the peak season, but you cannot have something that operates, I would say, optimally at any regime. You have to pick certain conditions, and the problem is that what the market demands may not be aligned with your peak productivity, the peak productivity status of your warehouse.
Okay, and when we first kind of discussed today's topic, smoothing warehouse operations, you're very kind of particular about the word smoothing. Why is this word quite so important compared to something perhaps like streamlining?
So I'm referring to the idea that the day-to-day operations of the warehouse can be smooth. So basically, the idea is that the amount of manpower that you need is basically pretty much the same from one day to the next. I'm not referring, streamlining would be, for example, to invest in a new conveyor belt so you can, improve the overall productivity of your warehouse. But once this investment is done, you're back to, I would say, the initial situation, which is you want to smooth, your daily operation from one day to the next, just because variations requires, more or less staff, and it's very difficult to accommodate. And typically, because it's hard to accommodate, the best way would be not to have to accommodate those variations at all. So you can really have just a steady stream of operation where it's pretty much the same workload every single day. And the question is, how do you achieve that? That would be, how do you achieve that? And the answer is, typically, if you're stuck by just looking at what is happening within the warehouse, you cannot. But as soon as you start looking at the warehouse, at the supply chain as a whole, then it becomes possible by doing network level optimization to smooth the daily operation of any single warehouse.
Okay, so let's kind of look at some of the challenges that are involved then. You mentioned a little bit about kind of manpower. The thing that's kind of interesting here is, from kind of my perspective when we first spoke about this, is the idea that as manpower kind of increases, you're using more staff, the costs don't kind of increase linearly. So why is that?
The cost doesn't increase linearly just because contractors cost more, and they have less training. So you see, if you had your usual team and it's 50 people and you need to bring 20 people extra, maybe those 20 extra people will cost you as much as your 50 people that you already had, because they were contractors. You need to accommodate for the flexibility. If you want to have people that are completely flexible on demand, they charge more by the hour. Otherwise you would only have contractors. So basically, that's just the reality of the market is that flexibility is an option, but it's an expensive option. And usually, by being relatively inflexible, you can lower your cost. So it's very interesting. A warehouse, you end up with economies, diseconomies of scale whenever you diverge from your, I would say, your nominal optimal regime.
So let's talk about maybe the current approach. So how well do classical approaches work when it comes to working in this kind of ideal regime?
So the classic, it's very interesting. I mean, the classical perspective, from a classical supply chain perspective, this problem do not even exist. I mean, when you look at the theories, and that's something very, very puzzling, is what do I mean? I mean, the classical supply chain paradigm. I'm referring to the belief that there is something that exists that is called a SKU, and the belief that there is something that exists that is called a time series. I believe that neither SKUs nor time series are really real. They are just modelization perspective on your warehouse. And so the classical, I would say, supply chain paradigm basically emphasizes SKUs and time series. And it turned out that when you take this perspective, the operations that the workload of your warehouse is not something where you have any control. So, and thus, you end up with something that is very odd when you think about it. You end up with people trying to forecast the workload of warehouses so that they can adjust the staff. And I would argue that this is pretty much I would say, a completely wrong viewpoint on the problem. So it's very interesting because from the classic perspective, the idea of optimizing warehousing operation, smoothing them, is just something that is not available as an option because there is nothing in the paradigm that gives you any degree of control over that. So, and it's very interesting because any warehouse managers that I've met, realize that they have those massive diseconomies of scales when the warehouse diverge from the regime. So obviously, smoothing the flows is of prime interest. I mean, it's like an obvious move. But when people step back and say, how are we going to do that? They realize they don't have any levers. There is nothing in the organization, the software, etc., that gives them any control. Right. And the problem is that at the core, it's a paradigm in which there is where the control is not even possible.
Okay, but surely that kind of warehouse manager is just kind of reacting to demand that's happening upstream. So how much control can they actually have? Because they're just reacting to what ultimately customers are buying.
But are there? Are there? And usually, you see, that's the sort of things where people jump to the conclusion, oh yes, I mean, we have a demand-driven whatever system. Or yeah, it's very rational. It's driven by sales and sales history and whatnot. But is it? You see, because again, let's go back to the paradigm. The paradigm is you have SKUs and time series. Where is the network? The network do not exist in your paradigm. And I would argue that usually the network, the supply chain network, doesn't exist as such in any pieces of the software that is actually running the supply chain. And it may sound puzzling because people say, but we have all the transactions, we have all the stock movements. So certainly the network exists. I would say, no, it doesn't. And actually, when you look at how, I would say, the vast majority of supply chain software are implemented, what does that mean that you have a SKU? It means that basically you have replenishment going on for the stores, but replenishment is done according to some kind of, I would say, glorified min-max policy. So min-max, what is a min-max policy? It just means that you have a trigger condition that's going to be your mean stock level. So basically, when you reach a certain level of stock, you trigger a replenishment. So basically, a min-max is basically first you have a condition to met, and then once you are meeting this condition, you're going to trigger a certain quantity to be replenished. This quantity can be just one, Kanban style. You sell one, you replenish one. But sometimes, because there is like lot multipliers, because you have packs, because you have like economic order quantity, because you have many other constraints, you will shoot for a slightly bigger quantity. And thus, from the warehousing perspective, you end up with every single day with tons of downward skews that end up meeting their trigger condition, their mean, and thus you end up with all those skews that says, send me more stuff. And thus, you end up with a list of things that needs to be done, on a daily basis by the warehouse itself. But when you look at that, the warehouse has zero control on any of those triggers.
Okay, so what you're sort of saying is taking that kind of skew time series approach, you're very much looking at things in isolation and you're not taking into account kind of the rest of the network and how that kind of interacts. So what would be a better way then? How would you kind of smooth out those activities and reduce those kind of spikes?
Before jumping to that, you need to further analyze, what is happening with skews, because otherwise, solution kind of, it's very hard to make sense of it. The first thing that happens when you have skew plus time series analysis is that you end up with plenty of synchronization within your supply chain network. And you would think, oh, it's very nice. I have synchronized events in my supply chain. But no, it's absolutely not. You in terms of smoothing the flows, that's pretty much your worst case scenarios.
What would be an example of one of those synchronized events?
Let's assume that, for example, you have like a warehouse serving stores and you have a stock out from your supplier. So what is happening? One of your supplier has a stock out. So you cannot serve for a given product, the product to stores. So the stores gradually run out of stock. Obviously this is a bit random. Some stores had more or less stock initially when the supplier went out of stock. But let's say after a few days or a few weeks, we can reasonably assume that all the stores are out of stock. And the warehouse is out of stock as well for the product. And then the supplier is back in stock. So what is happening is that at the minute where your supplier is back in stock, you will have like a big wave of products that will flow across your supply chain to basically replenish all the stores at once. And because probably your stores are similarly designed, they have plenty of similarities, it means that initially you might have thought that all the stock levels were completely, I would say, were randomly distributed across your stores, but the stock out has just synchronized the replenishment pattern for the given product across your network. So you see, all the stores went out of stock at the same time, and all the stores are getting back in stock in the same time. And if you look at the time series of flow for the product, you will see a drop to zero, a big spike, and then chances are that you have like very strong residual oscillation, like echoes of your stock out. And actually you have many elements that provoke those oscillation. That could be, so stock out is one, promotion is other ones. You can have calendar effects. I mean, there are plenty of things. It doesn't matter if it's actually retail network or a manufacturing, multi-echelon supply chain. You have the same sort of phenomenon. So basically, you have plenty of phenomenon that actively create by default synchronization and thus oscillation in your supply chain.
Okay, but things like promotions are always going to exist. So how can you go about smoothing them about? Is it more a case of the warehouses are pre-warned and they can have stock ready when these promotions sort of come?
So the thing is that if you want to solve the problem, first you have to reject the paradigm that created this problem in the first place. And that's probably the most bizarre and intriguing perspective, is that there are frequently problems where the only way to tackle the problem is first to start looking at the problem from an other angle. And sometimes something exceedingly puzzling happens is that when you start looking at the problem from another angle, you kind of get the solution for free, literally. And it's very puzzling, and but it does happen once in a while, and this is one of those situations. So let's first try to see how we can actually look at the problem from a different perspective, and then we will investigate, if by any chance we can't get the solution for free. So the different angle is basically something that Lokad has outlined in its quantitative supply chain, manifesto years ago. It's all possible futures or decisions, all of that prioritized by economic returns. So if we start looking at the problem from this quantitative supply chain perspective, what do we have? we don't have SKUs anymore. We don't have time series anymore. What we have is units of products. Each one of them being, a snowflake. We don't try to pack all those things into SKUs. And the question we ask ourselves is, there is like all those possible futures where the market will ask for different things. We can't know them, so there is like irreducible uncertainty. And the decision is the warehouse can decide to ship one unit downstream to one location. So the question is, which unit are we interested in? And we can look at the unit that is maximizing the economic returns. So there will be one unit that is the most profitable across the entire network. If we had only one unit to send downstream, that would be it. So it's not, again, this is not about sending X units from a given SKU or a given product. It's literally, I'm counting everything down to the very unit. And then conceptually, once I've decided that my number one unit would be this one unit, I can decide, I can investigate which would be my number two unit, the second one. And again, we can investigate all locations, all units, all the economic returns, and figure out what is the second most profitable unit. And we can walk downward this list.
Okay, and you have kind of an infinite kind of list of decisions, and they're all kind of prioritized. So is the idea that you would never get to the bottom? How do you decide where to kind of end the list?
So first, you will get to the bottom because at some point, your warehouse is empty. So you see, you have just a finite number of units sitting in your warehouse. So the number of decisions is potentially conceptually infinite, but the reality is that it's very much finite. It's limited by the sheer number of units that is in your warehouse. And you might think, oh, but my warehouse has millions of units. Yes, but computers are powerful nowadays. And even if you have to enumerate millions of units, it's no big deal. A single core on a computer does billions of operations per second. So I'm not saying that it's easy, but it's certainly, it's certainly very feasible. So back to that, you can look at the problem from, well, let's truncate this list, prioritize list, to the optimal regime of the warehouse. And this is it. If you do that, you get the solution for free. You have a warehouse where you've just decided that what you would be sending today would be exactly matching your optimal regime in terms of flows for the warehouse for the day. And remember that when we were looking at the problem from the SKU plus time series perspective, those options did not exist because the warehouse manager there was no such thing as a prioritized list of action. It was just list of replenishment, and that was a given. The only option for the warehouse was just to ignore those quantities and maybe ignore some let's say stores. So not serve certain stores, not serve certain products, but they didn't have anything granular to decide exactly what to do. They just had replenishment orders that say ship 50 units towards this location. And then you have another order that say ship 25 units to this other location. Which one of those two orders is more important? The classical supply chain paradigm doesn't say. It doesn't, and this is not even a question being asked. Thus, because it's not a question, there is no answer. And if you look from the Lokad way of the Lokad way of looking at the problem, which is a different paradigm, where you have this prioritized list where every single unit gets its economic reward, suddenly, if you want to smooth the flow of the warehouse, it's a given because it's just a matter of truncating the list of what you want to expedite to the optimal regime of the warehouse.
Okay, so how are they basically deciding how much workforce to apply on a daily basis?
So here we have to go back to, I would say, the supply chain network as a whole. The interesting analysis that we have done many times with various clients is that what are, I would say, when you prioritize your units to be expedite, from a warehouse, looking at the first unit, second unit, third unit, etc., you will see that you have a strong law of diminishing returns. So that means that the first units that you need to send are typically have enormous economic value. Why? Because basically you're preventing highly probable stockouts. So, and it's the same sort of pattern whether it's a multi-echelon supply chain in FMCG or, let's say, a retail network. So basically the first unit that you send are critical because otherwise downstream clients or a manufacturing unit or an assembling unit is going to face a stockout. So those have very significant, I would say, impact. But as you walk through the list, I would say very rapidly, you're just, increasing your safety net. So every single unit that you send down the list, I mean, you're actually gaining your economic rewards diminish very rapidly. So that means that, and what is interesting is that typically, I would say for when you look at a regular supply chain network, I mean, there is no such thing as a regular supply chain network, but let's say, typically the situation that you end up with is that, let's say your supply chain network there are, let's say, 100,000 units flowing through the network every single day. So that means that, let's say, your warehouse somehow end up expediting, in this simplistic scenario, on average, 100,000 units every single day. Well, if you look at the first 10,000 units that are being sent by the warehouse, what you would typically observe is that the economic, reward associated to those first 10,000 units out of 100,000 is literally 100 times more than the last 10,000 units. So it's really, I mean, it's not just slowly diminishing returns, it's like super rapidly diminishing returns, where the top 10% of what you send is literally worth 1 times more than the last 10%. So that means, let's go back to the warehouse. Is it really going to make a difference if on any given day you decide that you're going to expedite 90,000 units or 110,000 units compared to just expediting 100,000 units? The answer is it almost makes no difference whatsoever. And that's very puzzling because, again, old-time practitioners, they were thinking from the classical, paradigm perspective, is when the warehouse doesn't have the capacity, if, for example, the warehouse need to expedite 100,000 units today and they can only expedite 90,000, usually they say it's a big problem. But why is it a big problem? The answer is it's a big problem because the 10,000 units that they cannot expedite are not prioritized. So potentially, out of those 10,000 units that they cannot expedite, there might be things that are absolutely urgent and critical. And because there is no prioritization taking place, nobody knows. And usually, well, odds are, just because they do it kind of randomly, by necessity, because they don't have any alternative, odds are that those you have, 10% of the 10,000 units that you cannot expedite today. 10% of that are part of the 10% most critical things that you should be sending today. But because you can't prioritize, you end up with a big supply chain incident. So back to the situation is that when you see those diminishing returns, you only need to roughly balance, the equilibrium of your network.
Okay, if we start sort of wrapping things up then, for a supply chain director who's probably watching this, why is it that smoothing is quite so important? Is it something that they could easily implement and change from that classical skew kind of time series approach? Or is it something that's actually quite challenging and will take a long period of time to adjust to?
So smoothing, I would say, I've discussed with many supply chain directors. Smoothing, I think, has always been in the background for decades. So it's an obvious move that is obviously of interest, again, because of those diseconomies of scale as soon as you diverge from your optimal regime, your optimal flows. So it's something that is both obvious, but from the classical paradigm doesn't have any solution. So is it from the classical perspective possible? It is not. So it doesn't matter, and it's interesting because when you have a problem with a problem of perspective, it doesn't matter whether your technology is, super crude like moving average or super advanced like deep learning, because from your paradigm, this problem doesn't have a solution. So first, you need to kind of reframe the problem. And the interesting thing is when you take the problem, from this quantitative supply chain manifesto perspective with all possible futures, all possible decisions, and all of that prioritized according to economic rewards, you get the solution for free. So I would say if you're willing to change your paradigm, well, you kind of get the solution for free. So literally, it becomes something that is very easy. But changing the way you look at the problem is actually quite difficult, because you see that's something where you need to reimagine the very same supply chain networks that you've seen the entire life and look at it from a completely different perspective. And by the way, at Lokad, it took me and the teams, several years to get to the point where we had found a way to look at the problem from a completely different angle, where the solution was possible. Because it's not obvious. It's not like there is nothing that says your perspective on this problem is wrong. I mean, you have a perspective. You just for years, and the initial years of Lokad was we were thinking we just need a better time series forecast. And maybe if we have like a better time series forecast, then everything will fall into place. And for example, if we had like the perfect time series forecast, remember what I said about the warehouse manager who wanted to have like a perfect demand forecast for his or her warehouse. If you're thinking in terms of time series, you're thinking, I just need a perfect forecast, and then that will solve my problem. Yes, but the problem is this perfect forecast does not exist. And interestingly, if you change your perspective on the problem, then the very need for a perfect forecast doesn't exist anymore either.
Okay, we'll have to sort of wrap it up there, but it certainly sounds like maybe with some of these classical approaches, many people are kind of burying their heads in the sand and pretending these problems don't exist at all. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.